An object at rest stays at rest unless acted on by an external force, that force being gravity. The force of this book hitting the table is its mass times the acceleration, the 9.8 meters per second that it falls at. And then of course, when it hits the table, the downward force is met with a reactionary upward force. Those are the laws of motion by Sir Isaac Newton, and I doubt you'll find anyone who's gonna argue the validity of those laws in physics. Today, we're gonna take those laws and show you how they apply to your business. I hope you enjoy. Force equals mass times acceleration, actions and reactions. Today, we're gonna go over the first two laws, the law of inertia and force equals mass times acceleration. If you want my take on actions and reactions, then all you have to do is DM me on Instagram, Newton, and we'll send you a link with an unlisted video on YouTube on my Paul Daily business channel. Diving in number one, the law of inertia. Ollie, if you can put this on the screen, an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. To better comprehend this, let's go back to physics for a sec, and you would see in physics something called an ideal system. In an ideal system, let's imagine a ball rolling on a flat surface, and it's rolling in this case right. In an ideal system, this ball would roll forever. There would be no friction that stops its momentum, circular momentum, from rolling forward. There'd be obviously no obstructions in the pathway. This ball would just roll forever. It would never stop. That would be in an ideal system. But in the real world, we have other forces like gravity and like friction. So you would see in the real world is the same ball is rolling, would eventually stop. If you kicked a soccer ball, you would recognize this, or if you rolled any kind of basketball or baseball, etc., you would see that friction eventually would take its course and that ball would come to a standstill. That is an opposing force. The last picture I want to give you about this ball is imagine for a second that this ball was at a standstill. This ball was not moving. There is a force of friction called static friction that we face in the real world that is keeping this ball still. And if you wanted to move this ball, you would have to give it a force enough that breaks what's called static friction. That static friction, the ball at a standstill, requires more energy to be applied. It requires more force to move this ball than if the ball was already moving with momentum. Once the ball is moving, it requires less force to be applied in order to counteract friction, but to first start the momentum of the ball requires more force. You have to beat friction, static friction, that is. To bring this home, static friction is resistance to initial movement. Once the ball is rolling, you now have to deal with rolling friction, which applies much less force. Now I want you to take this idea, put it in your head, and apply this kind of visual to you creating attention in your business. Note, before we get into this, if you didn't see yesterday's video on the laws of thermodynamics applied to business, part of this won't have context, because what I'm about to get into is that to be a category king or to be a category leader in your space, you need to create attention. And the two ways to create attention are through content and paid media. With that in mind, let's use an example from both. Let's pretend that you are a business owner, like many of you are, trying to create YouTube videos for business. Most business owners, most creators don't understand that it is the law of inertia keeping them from growing their YouTube or from scaling their paid ads and seeing success when they're paid. Let's go back to this ball for a second. Let's say this ball is at a standstill and we are trying to beat static friction, which means we need to impose more force than static friction is holding it with. Let's say to do that in this example, we need to apply 10 pounds per square foot. In this example, if we put 8 pounds of force behind this ball for 1 minute, for 50 minutes, for 100 minutes, for as long as you could ever imagine, it would never move, even though we're slowly applying force. Because the force that we're applying is not enough to break the imposing force of static friction. Instead, we need to impose more force than 10 pounds per square foot in this case to get the ball moving, and then we can reduce the amount of force we're imposing because now we're only going to be fighting against rolling friction, which is much easier to fight against. Now the same is true, the same analogy plays out when you're trying to gather attention for your business. Whether you do paid or content, today we're going to focus on content, you have to break static friction. You have to break inertia. And you do that by what we call the Blitzkrieg Principle, by imposing an immense amount of force to the ball at the get-go. You break static friction and then you can reduce volume so you're fighting rolling friction. Getting the momentum of attracting attention is all about how much force we apply at the very beginning to change the state of the ball, to change the state of our attraction assets, like YouTube or ads or such, so that we beat static friction and have momentum. The amount of force we have to apply is what we learn in law number 2, force equals mass times acceleration. The force of an object equals its mass times its acceleration. There are two variables that I have to break down here, m for mass and a for acceleration. For the sake of sounding smarter, I wish this was more complex, but it's actually really simple. Your mass is, in my opinion, consisting of two things. The argumentation you have behind what you're trying to get people to believe in. This could actually even root to, in general, the beliefs that you're trying to get people to believe in. So many people aren't actually creating content that changes beliefs, which is mind-breaking. The secondary side, I would argue, is the amount of distribution channels that you use. Some people could argue this could be part of A. But for acceleration, I argue it's just one specific thing, and that is frequency. You'll hear guys like Hermosi call this volume. So if we redesigned the equation F equals ma with our personal use case variables, it'd be force equals argumentation times frequency. The reason I'm not putting distribution channels as an adder or multiplier really right here with argumentation is because I'm really focusing on one channel dominance, meaning it doesn't matter how many distribution channels you have, if it's on podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TikTok, etc., Instagram, if you're trying to conquer YouTube and get the attention ball rolling with YouTube. If from an overall perspective, argumentation times distribution channels times frequency would be like F equals AD, like that, in parentheses, times frequency. That is how we calculate force. If we go back to the ball, I'm gonna go down here for a second and we're just gonna make a new ball. Meaning, let's say this ball is your business. Then if you want to beat static friction, which is imposing force against the ball, the way you calculate the force you need to apply to move the ball is the equation we have here. Force equals argumentation times frequency. Here's where most people break. Number one, we're not even going to get into it today, but their argumentation is awful. Most people don't actually understand how to re-architect beliefs. They don't actually understand what their problem statements are and their missionary problems. There are so many things that most businesses don't have, which makes content incredibly difficult. Even if you're creating content, you don't get the viewership you're looking for or the attention. Almost always it's because you don't know how to properly position arguments. If you want help with that, again, go to Instagram, DM me Newton, my team will be in touch. This is the issue that I face with the majority of the business owners I help, and that is that they don't run enough frequency to apply enough force to beat static friction. So many business owners that I know are trying to post 1, maybe 2 times a week on YouTube. Or maybe they're trying to do 1 short a day. And I'm not talking about redistributing. By the way, distribution channels, again, is different than frequency. It doesn't matter if you create 1 short, if it goes on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, etc. That's 1 piece of content. I don't count that as multiple pieces of content. The frequency of that is no higher, it's just distributed more. And my guess as to why most people do this 1 to 2 posts per week frequency on YouTube is that they see larger accounts doing it. What they don't understand is that the larger accounts aren't fighting static friction anymore, they're fighting rolling friction. They can get away with less imposed force because their ball's gonna keep rolling. But if you're trying to get your ball to move for the very first time, if you're trying to get your business to create some kind of momentum and gather attention for the very first time, you have to increase frequency. You either have to have the best argumentation in the world, but even argumentation times 0 is still 0. Argumentation times 1, if you're posting 1 times a week, is still the most minimal amount that you can be doing. When I first started my channel, I was posting 5 times per week, 5 times per week, 20 times per month. That is 5 times faster than the average person's frequency. And I did that because I knew I was fighting static friction. I was trying to get something to move that has never moved before. To start pushing that ball, I had to impose much more. Just think about it physically. Imagine there's a massive granite ball and you have to put everything you have into pushing this ball, and slowly you can feel just a little bit of rotational momentum and you can feel it turning. And as soon as you have that, you know you won, and you finish pushing, and then and before you know it, you're pushing much less and you're seeing much more reward for it. That is what creating content for your business is like. At first, it's a gruesome amount of frequency, amount of force that you have to apply in order to get this ball to move. But once it starts moving, you barely have to do anything and it continues to move. The second part of that first law is an object in motion stays in motion unless acted on by an external force. Yesterday we got into entropy, which you could look at as friction in this case, meaning realistically the fighting force. If you stop pushing the ball, eventually it will roll to a stop. But an object in motion stays in motion. If you create assets, long-living assets like YouTube, this is why I don't love short-form content. Short-form content has a lifespan of like 24 hours, but YouTube, you can have YouTube videos do well for years. These long-term assets, once the ball is in motion, stays in motion. And only with a complete negligence, meaning realistically completely not posting, will entropy or friction start to slow that ball down. All you have to do is get the ball moving. But most people don't apply enough force to break static friction, to break inertia, and they do a frequency meant for rolling friction. But like I said up here, if you need 10 pounds of force per square foot to break static friction and you only apply 8, it doesn't matter If you post one video per week for 52 weeks, what you'll find is the channel never picks up. The channel never does as well as you're looking for because you're not applying enough force to break static friction. Is look at force equals argumentation times frequency. If you want to, again, look at it from a more multi-channel perspective than distribution of channel. Force equals ADF, depending on how you look at it. That is how you break static friction. I now am finally actually working on my argumentation. For the first 9 months of content, I got to 20K in 6 months by just sheer frequency. My argumentation for what I was getting into was weak, but because of amount of frequency that I posted, I grew a following. Now I'm working on having better argumentation, better hooks, better videos, so that the amount of frequency I'm posting is multiplied more effectively by better messaging. That is what top tier players do. That is what I am trying to learn to do. That is what I'm teaching you in hindsight that I learned 6 months ago, a year ago. I hope this video helps. If you want to see, again, law number 3, reactionary forces, then feel free to DM me Newton on Instagram. If you want my help breaking static friction inside of your business so you can gather more attention, create more leads, and sell more, acquire more clients, that is how we apply the Blitzkrieg Principle. I'm happy to talk to you about it. DM me Newton on Instagram, and my chat flow will give you the option to book a call with us. I will see you tomorrow and yesterday and today, because again, F frequency, I'm getting the ball rolling again. Until next time, happy hunting.